Welcome back to your Tuesday Buckeye Talk. We're back to football. Doug Maurice, Nathan Baird, Stephen Means. If you want to hear 2 hours of yelling about basketball, you can listen to the Monday podcast. If you care at all about basketball or sort of the standards of Ohio State athletics, I have a thing I would like to do in the next 2 weeks to address the standards of Ohio State athletics that I think applies across the board, where it doesn't apply, where it does apply, but that'll be for later. For now, we are continuing to go through this football team, Nathan, based off the great interview session we had last week. We want to give everybody their fair shake. Today, we're doing Larry Johnson on the defensive line. We have Perry Aliano and Tim Walton planned for later this week. We have Jim Knowles and James Laurinaitis planned for later this week. We're going to hit Mark Pantoni and the recruiting operation later this week. But we're going to start with Larry Johnson. And for both of you guys, Nathan first and then Stephen, I wanted to get you right off the top. I think we might be at an interesting point with Larry Johnson in that Ohio State football has not faced, since Woody really has not faced like, hey, this is an absolute legend, one of the greats, who's now getting older. And the questions that arise from that, not the insistence of like, oh, that's it, but the questions that arise with that, right? Because Jim Tressel saw his end before we got to that. But we know what this looks like with college football head coaches. And I didn't have time to look it up, but I wrote a story like 5 years ago now, probably, about the relationship between Larry Johnson and Tyquan Lewis and how Larry Johnson was maybe starting to think about retirement. And then here was this kid that maybe was like, that's why you stick around, because of this kid. Because Tyquan Lewis needed Larry Johnson. He didn't just need a good coach. He didn't just need a mentor. He needed Larry Johnson. What did Larry Johnson do? Larry Johnson took this 3-star from North Carolina and helped turn him into the Big Ten Defensive Lineman of the Year and a second-round NFL draft pick, and a guy who not only maximized, but I think overachieved his potential at Ohio State. What a story. That's what Larry Johnson does for people. But Nathan, the angle of that was, hey, this is a guy who's maybe thinking about hanging it up, and we are way past that now. He's 70-plus years old, and I'm not trying to say no one's trying to get Larry Johnson out of here. But is it something that now is on our minds? And then Stephen, I think, can get into this even more. It's certainly one of those things that comes up in recruiting, and I'm sure other teams bring it up in recruiting. But Nathan, just generally, this guy is as good as it gets with what he does, but he's now been doing it for a really long time.
Yeah, I was listening back to his interview this morning, and then obviously we've had these discussions with him in the past. And this is probably a very insulting analogy, but I'm going to go ahead and make it because I think it's maybe a touch point for what we want to actually say here. But to me, is Larry Johnson like a great TV show? Is Larry Johnson like Game of Thrones, where like those first few seasons of the show are like transformational? Like they change the way people look at television. They are must-see, like appointment TV. After every Sunday night on HBO, everybody comes in Monday and they can't wait to talk to everybody about it. And that's how the early seasons of Larry Johnson were. And now it's getting into the later seasons. And maybe the show isn't as good as it was those first few seasons, but isn't it better than most everything else that's still on TV? Like that's maybe the point of the Larry Johnson discussion is you can't always just judge a guy by player, coach, whoever, by the very best that they've ever done. You also have to judge them by what else is being done out there in college football. And is Larry Johnson in the back of his career still better than what Ohio State would go get from somebody else?
And for instance, if Jeff Goodman was on this podcast, he would compare Larry Johnson to the worst years of the Thad Matta era and say, aren't you lucky to have Larry Johnson compared to that? Stephen.
Be careful what you wish for.
Is this, go listen to basketball, 2 hours of basketball shouting. Stephen.
2 hours. I went to listen to it this morning. It wasn't up here. I didn't see it. 2 hours.
Well, Stephen and I did 90 minutes, and then I told Stephen, I'm just going to wrap up a couple things, go ahead and leave. And then my couple things wrap up. Got away from me.
The thing is, wrapping up a couple of things for normal people is like 10, 15 minutes. Wrapping up things for Doug is 2.5 hours while then having to cut some of it down. It's like, you know what? Maybe this is too much.
Hey, yeah, what about this? I didn't even think of that. Yeah, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that.
That pod was longer than any actual Ohio State basketball game that's been played this year.
But also more interesting than any Ohio State basketball game that's been played this year.
Definitely more interesting.
Yes.
We lived up to the hype.
At least, yeah. It might not be good. I didn't say it was good. I didn't say it was better. I said it was more interesting.
Yeah.
Buckeye talk.
Stephen, where does this become a recruiting conversation? Are we there? I feel like we've danced around this at times in the past where Ohio State or Larry Johnson has said, like, hey, man, anybody who's doing that, I'm not going anywhere, right? Like, where are we with the recruiting conversation around this?
Yeah, you said you wrote that story 5 years ago. Yeah, well, we're 5 years into this, and it feels like every offseason, that's the main conversation when we talk about defensive line recruiting is, are the top guys in the country, are other schools telling them that, hey, Larry Johnson's probably not going to be there your entire career? I mean, when we were going through the whole JT Tuimoloau saga, that was part of it is, is Larry Johnson going to be there by the time JT's the best version of himself? And that's a thing every offseason, and it will be until he retires, which is what Nathan brought up with him talking. He was saying, I wonder if Nick Saban gets these conversations and these questions all the time. And he does. He just yells at the media, and Larry Johnson's just a nicer human being from that standpoint. So they deal with it differently. But there aren't recruits who are wondering whether Nick Saban's going to be there the entire time that they're at Alabama because they're still putting together elite recruiting classes. And so it's kind of the same thing with Larry Johnson here. So then I approached it a different way. It's less about what other schools are doing and maybe what Larry Johnson isn't doing, because he is older. And when you get older, you get set in your ways and you have a style that you like to do things. If you like your coffee in the morning at 9 a.m., you like your coffee in the morning at 9 a.m. And if someone gives it to you at 9:05, you're probably yelling at the sky. So I wanted to know whether it's because of NIL or because you struck out 3 times this past year with 3 highly rated guys, where typically Larry Johnson plays closer. Closer didn't work this time. Does that change your approach at all? And yes and no, there is some of this that they're not going to go after the guy who is clearly just in it for the NIL pitch and stuff like that. But you do have to continue to evolve with the times. And as you get older, it gets a little bit more difficult to be able to do that. But you have to continue to do it. Or if you don't, then you do end up being the last season of Game of Thrones where it's a complete letdown at the end of the road there. Great analogy, Larry, by the way.
Would you say, Larry, that this recruiting class was kind of like the season where Arya Stark was just hanging out with that guy with a lot of faces the whole time, and the whole season was just that guy with a lot of faces? And that kind of was this class where you didn't get Keon Keeley. And then it's like, well, then the faces mattered. I get it. That's the thing. The faces came back around. But in the moment, I was like, how many faces can this guy have? I get it. You got a lot of faces. Who cares? Stab somebody. So there's a payoff. But Stephen, so here's the thing that's difficult. If NIL didn't exist and Ohio State went 0 for 3 on big swings at defensive end at the end of a class, I think we could more definitively say, hey, something's up here. It feels like to me going 0 for 3 on those big swings, first of all, they got to be swinging. You can't stop swinging. But going 0 for 3 on those, I think we sort of went immediately to an NIL conversation. Is there anything else at play here, though? Is there anything else here that it's not that Larry Johnson isn't great, but is he throwing 93 when he used to throw 97 or 98? I don't know. Was that part of it why they didn't close, or was it almost really heavy NIL and the other schools just did a great job?
Yeah, no, this felt very NIL because of the schools they ended up at: Damon Wilson, Georgia, Keon Keeley, Alabama, who are they kind of approach it like Ohio State, but obviously they go a little bit. They're able to do some things that Ohio State has probably preached at this point. They just weren't at their capability, and then obviously Mateo Uiagalelei ending up at Oregon, who hadn't had a guy of his caliber since Kayvon Thibodeau 4 years ago. So because of the schools they ended up at, especially the Oregon one, you probably throw it more NIL, but. So his fastball is still good. It's still probably an elite fastball because they finished second probably in all 3 of those races. In fact, they were part of the reason why Keon Keeley decommitted from Notre Dame in the first place. But maybe you need to add some other pitches. Maybe when you get older, you start to add the changeup and the curveball, and those are the only 2 pitches I know in baseball because I don't know much else about it. But you just start to diversify what you can do out there because, as you get older, your fastball is eventually going to slow down. So if that's still the only thing you have in year once again, I don't know how long pitchers play in baseball, but in year 17, if the only pitch you have is a fastball the same way you had in year 2, it's probably not going to be as effective anymore. So at some point, maybe diversify the different styles. Maybe don't lock in on guys as, it's like, oh, these are my 3 guys. I'm with them to the end. And if it works, it works. JT Tuimoloau out. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. Mateo Uyunglele. Maybe you just like open the net a little bit, cast a wider net. And there's a couple of coaches you can apply that to.
So when I was in Little League, one of my teams, I was probably like the 4th pitcher, like emergency pitcher. It's like, there's 2 guys pitch, there's a 3rd guy, but if we're desperate, we'll put Doug in. So they brought me in one game, and I don't know what I did, but I struck out somebody to end the inning, and one of my teammates running off the field came up to me and said, "Man, that was a great changeup you just threw." And I was like, that is the hardest I can throw a baseball. So that was, whenever I think of a changeup, it's like, that is my 39-mile-per-hour heater, teammate, but thank you. Nathan, I think part of this here is, again, it's context. Larry Johnson has been the guy, right? At the best of Ohio State in this era, it was Larry Johnson on the defensive line and Kerry Combs in the secondary, bringing in big-time recruits. So Kerry Combs is gone. And the issue is, if Larry Johnson, I mean, it's just hard to, your peak, you don't have a 30-year peak. Nobody does.
What's your LeBron
Buckeye
James?
talk. Yeah. Well, but even this, I mean, LeBron, part of the issue is LeBron. LeBron needs Anthony Davis. If LeBron was on a team like the 07 Cavs right now, he would not, and also, by the way, the Lakers are like 11th in the West. He needs more help. That's exactly my point. Larry Johnson is still great. But there was a time, Nathan, where you could say, all right, well, if Larry Johnson is your best recruiter on the defensive side of the ball, who's your best defensive coach? Who's your best defensive recruiter? Larry Johnson. Great. That's a lot to put on a 70-year-old guy. So now, especially in a world where Kerry Combs is gone, it's time for somebody else to be the best so that Larry Johnson can be very good, but as you said, Nathan, not have to be the best. When Game of Thrones starts to go down a little bit, you better get that Kate Winslet basketball show in there. Hey, Kate Winslet, she was in Titanic. Now she's going to be a basketball coach. HBO, you can't just say, well, that's it. Game of Thrones isn't quite as good as it used to be. So now people are going to stop getting HBO. You've got to bring in something new, which might take us to a James Laurinaitis conversation, right? Which is like, you've got to find other people who can be great. Who's your number 1 recruiter on the defensive side of the ball? Because just like anything, if Larry Johnson's your 2 or you're even your 3, but Larry Johnson can't be burdened with saving the day on everybody. What do we think about this context, Nathan?
Well, let me make another potentially terrible television analogy. What made Thursday nights on NBC back when Steven was an infant must-see TV? It wasn't just Seinfeld, and it wasn't just Friends. It was Friends and Seinfeld. It was the combination. And Larry Johnson, for many of those years when he was, by all measures, great, like the guys he was bringing in and the way he developed them, no question the word great applies there. But the cornerback room was doing that too. And it was paired together like that. And as we've seen I'm not going to use the word collapse of the cornerback room, but certainly a deficiency in high NFL draft picks out of the cornerback room now for several years, that happens to coincide with where people have seen a drop-off at edge rusher. And I know this is a conversation that we've had before in other contexts, but I think it's an important one to bring up here, that as Larry Johnson, whether he's getting older or not, I think if we were to gone back 10 years, would Larry Johnson, just with his edge rushers, still have made the same impact if there wasn't Marshawn Lattimore, Denzel Ward, Garyon Conley, Eli Apple, the whole list of guys that were here at that same time and were working in concert with that edge rushing? That's also something that's missing right now. Larry Johnson has to carry more of the load, not just in this like vague responsibility, but or these vague terms, but like in the actual product that's happening on the field.
And when you see that, just the offensive side has that right now with the quarterbacks and the wide receivers. As elite as Brian Hartline is as a recruiter and developer, doesn't matter if they're not bringing in elite quarterbacks, and vice versa. Brian Day can be the best quarterback developer in the world, but if that quarterback's coming to the school, it's like, oh, there's no weapons here. They're probably going to stop coming over time. So to Nathan's point, yeah, you need both of those things for those, especially with those positions, quarterback, wide receiver, defensive end, cornerback. You hear it all the time. The front end and the back end work together. You can't have one without the other. The best recruiting class Urban Meyer had, he had Chase Young, but he also had Jeff Okudah, who committed 6 months after Chase Young did.
So what What was, because I was not at Larry Johnson's table and I did not go back and listen to it. What was the actual, what did Larry Johnson say about his future, about how he's doing his job right now? What were the words out of his mouth?
I can give you the exact quote. First of all, he actually, after giving this quote, he also made an analogy to Top Gun Maverick, which I thought that you would find especially intriguing. That he's like, because in Top Gun, they say something to Tom Cruise / Pete Mitchell about you're becoming extinct or something like that. But his exact quote was, "Until you see an empty chair here, then you'll know I'm gone."
If he's quoting Top Gun Maverick, he's got a 97-mile-per-hour fastball. I'm good. Conversation over.
He also said he's going to have a press conference, like a big old press conference when it finally happens. That was probably more of a joke, but who knows?
You know what? There are assistant coaches in the College Football Hall of Fame, right? You don't have to be a head coach or a player to be in the College Football Hall of Fame. I believe
so.
That feels like something that I should be looking up and not asking on a podcast. But this guy's a Hall of Famer, right? I mean, that's like, this guy's a Hall of Famer. So, like, if he would have said, hey, let me tell you, as they said in Top Gun, if you want to play sand volleyball, make sure you're wearing dungarees. If he would have said that, it would have been like, oh, my God, Larry Johnson's lost it. But he's not quoting Top Gun from 1986. He's quoting Top Gun Maverick. So, okay, we're all good. So he's not going anywhere. I mean, this is well, I mean, the reality of this, he is going somewhere at some point. He's not going to coach till he's 90. So this is going to be, now, we're at the stage now, once you're over 70, like, this conversation doesn't go away. And he actually, I think, is like right around the same age as Nick Saban, who I think just turned 70. But it's
both of them are 71.
So we're right there, right? I mean, it's not a, Larry Johnson is the Nick Saban of defensive line coaches. Like, I don't think that's I don't know that anyone would make that comparison, but I mean, he's as good as it gets at the thing that he does, which is what Nick Saban is. So this is just going to be a reality. And I do think it is something that is going to have to be worked out. And because, Nathan, just the way it works sometimes is sometimes people don't have the same timeline, and that the timeline of the individual whose career and life it is doesn't always match up with the timeline of their boss. And their view of their production and the way they're doing their job does not always match up with the view of their boss. And the bigger gap there is between those two views, the bigger the problem might be, Nathan. So I am not anticipating that this will be a problem for Ohio State. I don't think there's any reason to anticipate a problem. I think Ryan Day, I wouldn't expect it. And I think Larry Johnson he has been the consummate professional who he didn't get screwed by Penn State, but he certainly, I think, maybe gave Penn State more than Penn State gave him. I mean, this was a guy that wanted to be in the mix for the head coaching position twice and really didn't get more than a cursory glance. I just, this is a real dude who got to Ohio State and made an instant impact. And after they lost Mike Vrabel, they could not have done better than Larry Johnson. Ohio State was very fortunate to have Larry Johnson here for the last decade plus of his career. But they got to figure it out, Nathan, right? I mean, this is just life, and this is life at big time programs. This is like corporate stuff, right? It's not, you don't have a mandatory retirement age, but we are getting to the point where this needs to be monitored, I think.
Well, I think do you have somebody right on deck that you can promote into that job? Or do you, again, it goes back to what I was saying before, because I'm sure Ryan Day is thinking about this. He's evaluating the staff at all times. But again, I don't think he's evaluating, is Larry Johnson as great as he was at his peak? He's saying, if Larry Johnson leaves, who am I getting to come coach his defensive line? Who's as good as Larry Johnson is right now? I think that is a fair question to ask. I'm not even saying that I know the answer to that. I'm sure Ohio State would go out and find a very good coach. And I brought that up last week in the text too, though, that, they just hired another GA to work with the defensive line. And like every time that comes up, because there's a new one every couple of years, people are like, oh, is this the guy that's going to replace Larry Johnson? And I think my assumption is that is somebody they go outside, unless they really think that the guy inside is killing it. But I think they go outside and find someone to replace that level of gravitas and that level of just proven defensive line excellence and knowledge. I think they'd have to go outside to find that person, because it's not just it's what that position means to the whole staff, really.
They also haven't. I mean, we're gonna probably have a Laura and I discussion here at some point, but Ryan Day's hire from withins haven't been on defense. They've been special teams in offense, and the offensive thing is more just. I mean, he's an offensive guy, so maybe he can monitor that a little bit more. And more specifically, quarterback and wide receiver, two positions where he's just as important in what's going on there as the guy who's actually running the room. So I agree with Nathan. He doesn't seem as open yet to the hire from within defensive guys, because he's reset the defensive staff twice, and he's going outside with every single one of those hires every single time. But also, defensive line is too important of a position, especially in college football, NFL too, but especially in college football, for you to believe somebody can be something who's already in the building. That would seem like you would need to go outside.
And he doesn't know him as well. It's like he hires internally on the offensive staff because he's in the room with the quality control guys and the grad assistants, and he gets to know him. He's like, I like this guy. This guy seems smart. Let's keep him. And he doesn't know the defensive guys the same way. Okay, I think we needed to talk about Larry Johnson, and we'll all monitor it together. But this guy has been. We don't have to. Everybody knows the deal, and so I do think this. It's not like on the offensive line, but do they need a big hit in 2024 at edge rusher? Given that, I mean, again, who's the guy they got? Jason Moore, right?
Yeah, so that's the thing.
Like a Jack, like he's good. He's really good, right? Yeah,
Larry Johnson's had one bad recruiting cycle and still produced the top 100 recruit, who I think is really good. I think he's going to be a quality interior guy. Yeah, sure. Yes, probably. You probably do need to go get a dude in this cycle, just because JT seems like he's on the 3-and-done path. We don't know what Jack Sawyer might turn into this year. He might be on a 3-and-done path. Mike Hall might decide he's a 3-and-done path. There's enough guys here who are candidates to leave after 3 years that you probably just need to replace that abundance of talent. So it's not. I don't know if you had to list positions that need a dude in this cycle, it probably can't be higher than 5 on that list, but they probably need to go get one.
All right, when we come back, let's talk more about the players on the defensive line who play for Larry Johnson next on Buckeye Talk.